Final Fantasy VI was released in Japan for the Super Famicom and was brought over to the Super Nintendo Entertainment System in the US as Final Fantasy III in 1994. And nearly 30 years later, this game still features one of the greatest opening acts in all of gaming history. So what is it about this seemingly unassuming 16-bit game that makes it such a masterpiece? In one word, story. Final Fantasy VI features one of the greatest storylines ever told in a video game. It was deep and so much more sophisticated than it had any right to be for a 16-bit game of its time. Final Fantasy VI opens with a cutscene describing the current state of affairs in its world, with an industrial society on the rise under the rule of Imperial Command. It mentions whispers of a long-believed extinct force known as magic returning to the world, and it presents magic in a derisive manner as though it is dangerous and destructive. The color scheme is metallic, with industrial factories and heavy machinery painting the sky in a blood orange hue, which on the surface level may highlight the byproduct of smog from rapid industrialization, but also acts as a metaphor for dusk as the symbol of the sun setting on the end of an era. In the very next scene, we're introduced to a trio of Imperial troops in heavy armored mech suits on a cliff overlooking a vast mountain range. They're ordered to retrieve something called an Esper, and they're accompanied by a girl that one of them calls a sorcerer who fried 50 armored soldiers in just 3 minutes, before his partner reassures him that a device called a slave crown that she wears makes her completely submissive to Imperial command. We get a lot from this brief interaction of two Imperial troops just doing their jobs and following orders while cautiously wary of the girl accompanying them. The subsequent scene is one of the most well-renowned in Final Fantasy history, where the trio march through a heavy blizzard at night from the Imperial capital to a small mining community in the mountains. None of what we see is cheerful. It is dreary, it's night, it's cold, it's somber, and the music is wonderfully dramatic in a way that suggests the player is in store for a difficult journey. When this trio of Magitech Knights reaches the mining town of Narsh, it's clear this small town is far removed from the heavy industrialized Imperial capital. The citizens likely burn coal and firewood for warmth, and they use traditional water wheels for hydropower. A guard in the town recognizes the Imperial Magitech armor and claims, "Not even Narsh is safe anymore," which puts the player in the role of the aggressor representing the danger in this scenario. So these town guards, who defend themselves with handheld weapons like axes and lances, are little match for the guns, lasers, and rockets in the player's arsenal. The next set of guards proclaim, "Narsh's freedom depends on us," before they are wiped out along with their guard dogs. The final group of guards yell, "We must defend the mines," before rushing to their inevitable demise. These first few battles are interesting in that they offer little in the way of challenge. Clearly the player's party outmatches the civilians that oppose them, but the disparity in power is so lopsided that it's hard not to feel like bullies in the situation. So right off the bat, the player will question, are the characters I'm controlling the bad guys here? And it's not until our party reaches the mines that the more commonplace monsters of JRPGs are introduced as neutral enemies. But even then we have to wonder if they're attacking us because they see us as unnatural interlopers to their habitat. Even the so-called boss enemy of this mine, a giant snail-like monster called a whelk, is summoned by the guards of the town, and in this sense is more of a guardian for the people rather than a terrifying menace. This early bit of moral and philosophical greatness highlights the nuanced storytelling that this game managed to achieve in just its opening 10 minutes, and it sets the stage for what players would be treated to throughout the course of the game. When the trio finally defeats the whelk and makes it to the Esper they were seeking, it vaporizes the two male soldiers before a magical interaction stuns their female companion. She wakes up in a cottage where an old man has looked after her and treated her wounds. She stumbles out of bed and realizes she can't remember anything. And while this may seem like a tried and true trope of amnesia, so commonplace in JRPGs, things are a bit more nuanced here. The old man explains that she had been under complete control of the Empire while wearing the slave crown, and that her memories would return in time. And it's here that we get some of the real psychological depth of this story, because the question is, how horrific is it going to be when her memories do return and she remembers all the senseless slaughter and killing that she has participated in? How thankful is she going to be at remembering all the innocent people that died at her hands? And so in just a few moments, this girl went from deadly Imperial soldier to someone that players sympathize with. And just before we get a chance to play as this female character, we're given our first character caption that reveals her name as Terra and explains that she is a mysterious young woman controlled by the Empire and born with the gift of magic. And it's this word gift that deserves some attention, because so far the story has presented magic as a dangerous and destructive force. Magic is something that throughout the course of the game, this young woman will come to regard more as a curse than a gift. When Imperial soldiers bang on the door of the cottage and demand that the old man hand over the woman as an officer of the Empire, we realize that this man is risking his life to treat and look after a woman who just killed a dozen town guards, some of whom may have been friends or family to the old man, because he felt compassion for a girl who was forced to commit horrible deeds, not of her own free will. Instead of feeling hatred for her, he feels pity for the horrors she has experienced, and quite appropriately directs his animosity towards the Empire as the true antagonist. It's a mature, level-headed insight that shines in a 16-bit game of its time. So Terra makes a run for it through the caves before she's cornered by a group of Imperial soldiers and falls through a sinkhole to a lower level and passes out. It's then that she has a recollection of when she first had the slave crown placed on her head and was tasked with burning down a town and killing all of the soldiers there. Alongside her the entire time was a man who would eventually become a primary villain of the game, Kefka. And despite the crude 16-bit graphics, we can see that Kefka takes great joy at the violence and carnage that Terra is able to muster, as he laughs maniacally in the presence of it. During this flashback, we also get an idea of the Imperial hierarchy, with Emperor Gestal at the head, flanked by Kefka, Terra, General Leo, and Celes, who we'll come to know much better later in the story. Emperor Gestal makes a grandstanding speech about the Empire harnessing the power of magic in order to rule the world. This speech isn't particularly interesting by itself, but the scene is a nice bit of foreshadowing by showing some of these characters that would come to play significant roles as the story develops. We're then introduced to a fan-favorite character in Locke, who has garnered a bit of a reputation as a roguish thief, but insists on being called a treasure hunter. And it's easy to see why so many players regard him as their favorite character, as he will provide some world-weary insight into events and ongoings from a level-headed perspective, and even inject some much-needed whimsical humor when things start to get too dour. But his initial conversation with the old man who saved Terra is important in that it reveals that an underground resistance movement called the Returners has formed to oppose the Empire. So while the old man expresses compassion for Terra being mind-controlled by the Empire into committing horrible deeds, he also reveals that he sees potential in using her abilities and knowledge to support the resistance against the Empire. And while this exchange may make the old man seem somewhat disingenuous in saving Terra, it really reveals him as more of a pragmatist who is looking to do the maximum amount of good for the entire world, even if it means recruiting disenfranchised former Imperial soldiers to join the cause. And it's interesting how this one non-playable character, who we don't even come to know by name, has conveyed so much narrative depth in just a few lines of dialogue. So Locke agrees that helping Terra is the right move to make and plans to take her south to the kingdom of Figaro in order to lay low. But before he can do that, he has to find Terra in the mines and fight his way past a small company of Imperial soldiers with the timely help of some friendly Mughals who show up to assist. And it's worth mentioning that this is one of the few instances in the Final Fantasy series that players can take control of the cuddly little creatures that many consider to be the mascot of the series alongside the Chocobo. With the enemies dispatched, Locke and Terra make their way out of the mines and head toward the desert kingdom of Figaro. It's here that we meet the next major character in Edgar, the king of Figaro. And while Edgar may come across as someone who simply considers himself a debonair ladies' man that tries to pick up on women at every opportunity, Terra included, that outward guise belies a more complex character. Firstly, he is a master engineer who has designed weapons and various other instruments for his kingdom, and it's hard to begrudge a man who could easily sit back and enjoy the spoils of rulership, but instead puts his mind and effort towards innovation and invention to the benefit of his people. Secondly, Edgar is a consummate diplomat in that he has managed to keep his kingdom out of the crosshairs of the Empire by feigning allegiance while secretly plotting and collaborating with the Returners' resistance. The difficulty of maintaining this sort of ruse cannot be underestimated, as we soon discover just how easily the Empire will turn on an entire kingdom at the whims of a madman when Kefka makes his arrival shortly thereafter. But before things go haywire, Terra is allowed to explore the castle and comes across the midwife who helped raise Edgar since he was a child. She explains that Edgar has a twin brother named Sabin, who traded the throne for his own freedom. And while the character caption lets us know that Sabin will be a playable character at some point, we don't know when, and this sequence comes across as a nice little teaser of things to come. Terra also hears from the Chancellor that the issue of succession between the twin brothers was decided by a coin toss, more details of which will be revealed at a later time. And while she's discovering the castle, she has a heartfelt conversation with Locke, where she admits to being uncertain of what to do with her life. Part of it can be attributed to the temporary amnesia, sure, but it also has to be pointed out that Terra's story is the struggle of a young woman trying to find her way in a world full of complex military and political intrigue, which she will be drawn into whether she wants to or not. So the notion of what can be considered the right thing to do is murky at best, since her full realization of free will be impacted by forces well outside her control. So she is certainly free to choose where her life goes at this point, but her future is still partly decided by the whims of far more powerful forces surrounding her. And Locke's friendly reassurance that he can't tell her what to do, and that she doesn't have to decide right now, and that she will eventually find her way, must be incredibly comforting to Terra, who has, up until this point, been manipulated by the Empire and recruited by the Returners for her power. Just then, Kefka makes his unwelcome arrival to Castle Figaro, downplaying his visit as the search for a girl who stole something of minor importance. Edgar feigns ignorance, despite the thinly veiled threat Kefka makes on the off chance of non-compliance. It's no surprise then that Kefka, who has already been revealed as someone who revels in wanton destruction, would put the entirety of Castle Figaro to the flame simply because Edgar did not immediately capitulate to his demands. And it's in this moment that we get a real-time example of just how dangerous Kefka is as an official emissary for the Empire, who feels free to indulge his destructive nature however and whenever he sees fit. It instantly casts him as a truly frightening villain that will stop at nothing to achieve his goals, even if, or especially if, it involves the death and suffering of innocent people. So the trio of Edgar, Locke, and Terra make a daring escape riding on chocobos while the mechanically engineered Castle Figaro submerges into the desert sands below to evade any further Imperial aggression. And it's worth noting how delightful the idea of a king abandoning his people is to Kefka, who, again, thrives on chaos and disorder. Then, for the first time, the player now finds themselves on the other side of the Imperial conflict, with a party of characters fighting a duo of Magitech armor soldiers. It's a clever reversal of the opening scene where the player controlled the overpowered Imperial mechs to annihilate any citizens that stood in their way. So with the shoe on the other foot, the player is now in the crosshairs of heavy weaponry and attacks, and these enemies do hit hard. A single laser will easily reduce a character's health nearly in half, so 2 direct hits to Edgar immediately sees him kneeling in pain. And if the player decides to use Terra's fire spell in this battle, they'll be treated to a humorous dialogue sequence where Edgar goes bonkers at the sight of magic for the first time. But this bit of dialogue provides more than simple comedic relief, as it further plays into Terra's self-conscious dilemma of feeling inhuman and alone in a world that is unfamiliar to her. So Locke's reassurance that the only difference between Terra and the fellas is that she can use magic is the exact sort of comforting sentiment that Terra needs to hear, and further cements Locke as a consummate friend who is considerate of other people's struggle and suffering. So Edgar and Locke suggest that if Terra is to discover who she is and forge her own path in life, she may have to consider fighting the Empire to free herself from their machinations. With the Magitech Knights defeated, the game treats us to a nice little bit of Mode 7 technology as the party rides their chocobos to a nearby mountain cave that eventually leads to South Figaro. Once in South Figaro, the game does something very clever by teasing the player with a mysterious shadowy figure dressed all in black who makes his way through town to a nearby pub. Unlike most NPCs who dawdle about town, this character walks with a greater sense of purpose, and this is meant to entice the player into exploring the town and speaking to its residents. After speaking to a few of the patrons in the pub, we might notice a young girl make her way inside and take a seat at a nearby table. If spoken to, the girl asks, "Are kids allowed here?" What do you think? She then looks around to see if anybody notices and continues to park herself at the nearby table. It's a relatively whimsical and inconsequential interaction, but it adds to the character of the game and helps make the world feel lived in. The trio then encounters the aforementioned shadowy figure at the bar, and before he can say a word, a caption informs us of a character who will do anything for money. And we quickly discover that this character named Shadow will also become a playable character at some point. And before Locke can get a word in edgewise, Edgar warns him that this Shadow character is an assassin who would kill his own mother for money. It's a heck of a reputation, and an interesting tease if the rumors are to be believed. It would, after all, be the first time that the Final Fantasy series cast a cold-blooded killer as a party member. But that's something we as players will have to wait and find out, and it's yet another fine example of foreshadowing done right. So the group heads out to Mount Colt in order to meet with Bannon and the returners, and on the way they stop at a small cottage at the foot of the mountainside. In it, Edgar smells the familiar fragrance of his brother Sabin's favorite tea, and once again a single line of dialogue reveals a lot of characterization. The fact that Edgar remembers his twin brother's favorite tea after what has likely been more than a decade since the two last saw each other hints at a close bond between the two brothers. As they leave the hut, an old man tells them that the martial arts master named Duncan was recently slain, his son Vargas has gone missing, and that the resident of this cottage went up to Mount Colts to investigate. As our party has to travel through Mount Colts to reach Bannon and the Returners HQ, we're quickly moving towards a collision course with our first major boss fight in the game. When we finally encounter Vargas, he assumes that Sabin sent us to capture him and attacks us on sight. Sabin suddenly steps in and confronts Vargas about Duncan's death. It turns out Vargas killed his own father Duncan out of jealousy for being passed up as his successor in favor of Sabin. And while this may seem like a simple tale of envy and impatience on the part of Vargas, it belies a far more tragic turn of events for Sabin, who, despite his distaste for the issue of succession, which led him to leave his home of Figaro, he finds himself embroiled in yet another controversy for succession. Only now, it has cost him the life of his teacher, who he must have come to see as a paternal figure after the passing of his own father, and has also cost the honor of his friend Vargas. It's a cruel reminder that no matter how much we may wish to avoid and evade certain responsibilities that we find distasteful, we will nonetheless have to reconcile with those responsibilities at some point in our lives. So Vargas uses a special attack that blasts the rest of the party off screen and insists on a one-on-one fight to the death with Sabin. The interesting thing about this fight is that it can seemingly go on forever, as Vargas has over 11,000 HP, but the player can end the fight instantly if they use a blitz technique with Sabin. So the twin brothers are reunited, and Sabin's reasoning for joining the group on their quest against the Empire is worth pointing out. He has been on the sidelines for far too long, watching as the world slowly drifted towards chaos. He led a life of non-interference, and while this may have been a peaceful life, it's also one that chooses to ignore the danger and suffering in the world by sitting idly by. So to honor the memory of his former mentor, he claims Duncan would rest easier if he knew his disciple played a part in bringing peace to the world. And with that sentiment, Sabin moves from being an impartial witness in a troubled world to an active participant doing good in whatever way he can. It is a major philosophical shift. The group then finally makes their way to speak with Bannon at the Returners HQ, and here again we have an individual in a leadership position seeking to use Terra for her power. While Bannon may be seeking to leverage her power to oppose a tyrannical empire, it's a cold, hard reality check for the group and a reminder that no matter what side Terra may be on, she cannot escape the fact that war and conflict are in her future. Bannon even callously mentions the rumor about how Terra wiped out 50 armored soldiers in just a few minutes' time. When Terra shouts, "That's a lie," she's not denying that the event happened, but rather that she wasn't the one who committed the act, at least not willingly or knowingly. Terra will forever be haunted by the deeds she had committed while under the influence of Imperial mind control while she was wearing the slave crown. But those actions were not her actions that she would have made of her own free will. And Bannon's comments is a stark reminder that the world will forever see and judge her on the basis of horrific past actions that she mentally had never committed, even if her physical body played a role in it. This internal turmoil and torture is something that will follow Terra throughout the rest of the game, and it's not something that she can easily shrug off psychologically or emotionally. When Bannon asks Terra directly if she will be their last ray of hope, the player has the option to refuse. Now, a lot of players joke about older 8-bit and 16-bit era games that give players a choice to reject the option to be a hero and rise to the challenge, but in Final Fantasy VI, saying no to the returner's request makes sense. Terra is just now starting to piece her life back together, and her only memories are of the terrible things she had done while under control of the Empire. And now a rebel group that she barely just met, dedicated to fighting the Empire through guerrilla tactics and subterfuge, wants to place the hopes and fate of the world on her shoulders. Who would want that sort of responsibility suddenly thrust upon them? And who could blame her for questioning whether she's even capable of being a heroic savior? From a narrative perspective, the storyline unfolds the same whether the player chooses to accept or reject Bannon's request to join the Returners. While Terra is dealing with this philosophical quandary, a member of the Resistance stumbles into the HQ and falls over. He's beaten half to death and bears a message that South Figaro has been taken by the Empire. So Locke leaves the group to go recon the situation in South Figaro and see if he can't somehow curtail the Empire's actions. Edgar, Sabin, and Terra, alongside Bannon, take a raft up the Lette River towards Narsha in hopes of reaching the Esper from the opening scenes of the game. This is a peculiar narrative device as the player has encountered the Esper earlier, however briefly, and it has only been spoken of in passing by other characters since then. Now that the player is tasked with reaching the Esper on Narsha once again, it comes off as a nicely delayed payoff to an earlier storyline event. The second encounter with the Esper could also pay off another storyline thread by revealing a bit more about Terra's unusual ability to use magic. Mostly, we understand that the Returners want to intercept the Esper simply as a gambit for power before the Empire gets their hands on it. It's a nice way to weave multiple story beats towards one singular upcoming narrative event. So Edgar, Sabin, Terra, and Bannon take a raft down the fast rapids of the Lette River while fighting the occasional group of monsters along the way. Just as the group is about to clear the rapids, they have their first encounter with Ultros, a troublemaking octopus and a recurring villain that's going to be a thorn in their side throughout the game. When Ultros has sustained enough damage, he makes his escape and Sabin tries a powerful blitz attack to finish him off for good. But a distraction from Edgar causes him to lose his balance and fall off the raft. Thus, Sabin is separated from the rest of the group, and it's here that we get one of the best narrative devices in an RPG from this era. The game presents us with three distinct scenarios. Firstly, we have Edgar, Terra, and Bannon racing towards Narsha to reach the Esper. Second, we have Sabin, washed away by the raging rapids of the Lette River. And finally, we have Locke, sneaking into Imperial-occupied South Figaro to gather intelligence. The player is given the opportunity to tackle these scenarios in whichever order they choose. These three separate storylines highlight what makes Final Fantasy VI so great: its focus on individual character development. Sure, each character is wrapped up in a main storyline involving the Empire and the Returners, but they also each have their unique struggles that are personal to them. And it's the first time in the series that we see so much focus on individual character story arcs. Our first story arc sees Edgar, Terra, and Bannon sneak into Narsha through a secret cave entrance, and they make it to the house of the old man who rescued Terra and helped her heal up after her first encounter with the Esper in the opening scene of the game. We finally learn that this old man is named Arvis after Bannon calls him by name. Arvis explains that Narsha has decided to remain neutral in the conflict between the Empire and the Returners, which is surprising considering the recent Imperial encroachment that cost the lives of a dozen town guards. Yet it's also understandable that the people of Narsha would want to avoid any further bloodshed after seeing the full might of the Empire's Magitech soldiers. Amid this political discussion, we see another example of Final Fantasy VI's ability to say a lot with very few words when Edgar asks, "First, how are your people?" This singular line says a lot about a character who has had to bear the burden of rulership since his teenage years. His primary concerns are not in relation to the resistance or military or economy. He's most concerned about the people and their well-being. And when he admits that Esper is either going to save us or dig us an early grave, he uses the collective us, showing that he is concerned for the fate of the group, not just mere self-preservation, and that he counts himself as an equal among the people. Our second story arc sees Locke attempting to stymie and sabotage the Empire's efforts in South Figaro. but he's wasted too much time and now has to hurry over to Narsha to meet with the group. This section of the game introduces a humorous gameplay mechanic that allows Locke to use his steal command to not only steal items from enemies, but also steal their clothing in order to masquerade around town without drawing any suspicion. So using this new mechanic allows Locke to disguise himself as a merchant in order to use secret trade routes around town, and then disguise himself as a soldier to bypass eject points in order to steal some cider so that he can curry favor with some smugglers. This gets Locke through a hidden passage to the mansion of the wealthiest person in town, who, if spoken to, asks, "What have I done? I betrayed the town, and I didn't even need the money." It may seem like a throwaway line to reveal how the Empire got such a quick foothold into South Figaro without any military aggression, but it also reveals the lifelong torment this individual will feel for selling out his citizens to ensure that his accumulated wealth is protected. And this is something that most people will relate to when presented with the possibility of losing all they have worked hard for over a lifetime. He was willing to abandon his principles to preserve his legacy. It wasn't so much that he would gain additional wealth from the Empire for being a sellout, it was more about not losing what he already had in the face of a possible Imperial incursion. Is he a throwaway NPC? Maybe. But is it a surprisingly deep ethical and moral quandary? Definitely. And it must be said, the Empire likely would have taken South Figaro by military force regardless. At least this NPC's betrayal meant a relatively more peaceful occupation, even if it was to the derision of the local populace. As Locke sneaks his way out of town through some underground passages, he notices an Imperial general being chained and beaten by two Imperial soldiers who are enjoying their handiwork under the premise that she is a traitor to the Empire. So we get a character caption explaining that her name is Celes, and that she is a genetically engineered Imperial Magitech Knight. She is also one of the high-ranking figures shown earlier during the Emperor's speech while Terra was having a memory flashback. During the brutal beating, we see that she was branded a traitor for being a conscientious objector to the Empire's plan to poison the water supply of the nearby eastern kingdom of Doma. So Locke, overhearing the conversation, decides to help Celes escape, despite her being a former Imperial general. That's twice now that Locke has aided and abetted a former high-ranking Imperial official. And while it may seem in part due to his having a heart of gold and wanting to help anyone who has suffered at the hands of the Empire, even its former soldiers, it's also good policy to recruit individuals familiar with the inner workings of a tyrannical empire, especially when Locke is a member of a resistance in opposition to it. Our third story arc centers on Sabin, who washes up the shore of the Lette River in an unfamiliar area, where he runs into the ninja assassin Shadow, who informs Sabin that the Empire is set to invade Doma Castle and that the only path to Narsha runs through Doma. On the way to Doma, the two sneak their way through a military Imperial camp to gather information. They overhear soldiers who praise General Leo as their commanding officer, while dismissing Kefka as a lunatic who should not be in command. This brings up the classic Machiavellian leadership dichotomy between leaders who are loved and those who are feared. Clearly, General Leo represents the virtuous paradigm, as he is loved, admired, and respected by the soldiers he commands. Kefka, on the other hand, has anyone he encounters gripped in fear of his power. This is by way of Imperial command, along with his destructive disposition and blatant disregard for life. So the soldiers in the camp receive orders to invade Doma Castle, upon which we are introduced to Cyan, a warrior and retainer to the king. Doma's culture is an interesting mix of medieval chivalry and Japanese Bushido, which in many ways are simple analogs of a feudal code of honor embraced by knights and samurai respectively. The guards inside the castle admit that they are outmatched and will likely lose the castle in a prolonged battle. Cyan's virtue and character is revealed immediately as he proposes a one-on-one battle between himself and the enemy commander, with a winner-take-all approach that will save the lives of his people should he succeed. He is a man who is willing to risk his own life if it means even the possibility of sparing his people. It's also emblematic of a man who is willing to carry the fate of his people on his shoulders, which is no easy task. As a knightly samurai warrior, Cyan's specialty is sword techniques that do heavy damage to single or group targets. They are highly effective, but require the player to wait while they charge up, which is akin to Japanese samurai swordsmen who patiently maneuver for the perfect time to make the perfect strike and achieve victory. After Cyan successfully defeats the Imperial commander, the scene shifts back to Sabin and Shadow, who overhear a conversation between General Leo and an Imperial soldier. While the soldier is ready to follow any command set by General Leo, Leo instead urges the soldier to be patient in order to avoid any unnecessary loss of life. This is the mirror opposite of Kefka, who would delight in the carnage of battle and celebrate death on both sides of the conflict. Yet the soldier, who has so much respect for Leo, admits he will gladly lay down his life for the Empire if necessary. And in this moment, Leo takes a moment to connect with the soldier. He remembers the soldier's hometown, which shows that he gets to know the troops under his command. They are not just faceless cannon fodder to him. They are individuals with families, homes, and lives outside of the military. He looks genuinely somber and sincere when he admits that it is his responsibility to inform the families of soldiers who fall in battle. And this is the purview of a man who could easily delegate this responsibility to a lower-ranking officer. He also tells the soldier, "You have a life to go back to someday. Don't throw it all away for nothing." Emperor Gestal wouldn't want that. And this is the first time we've seen or heard reference to Emperor Gestal since an early flashback Terra had. It may be worth noting how General Leo presents Emperor Gestal in a sympathetic manner as an individual who cares about Imperial soldiers. Whether or not this is true is yet to be determined, but it could easily be that General Leo simply has the propensity to see the best in people. Meanwhile, a message sent from Emperor Gestal summons Leo back to the Imperial capital, leaving a lower-ranking officer in charge. This officer, like many of his peers, is deathly afraid of Kefka as a deranged lunatic. And as Leo leaves camp, there is a poignant interaction between Leo and Kefka, where Leo implores Kefka not to do anything rash, while Kefka berates Leo for lacking the guts to achieve victory by any means necessary. So while Leo has the compassion to see his enemy as human beings, Kefka sees an enemy as vermin that need to be exterminated. There are certainly real-world historical analogs to these opposing military leadership styles. So Kefka gives the order to prepare a poison that would contaminate Doma Castle's water supply, killing all who reside within, including the captured Imperial soldiers being detained within the castle. Having seen and heard enough, Sabin and Shadow confront Kefka in a quick series of battles, and interestingly, Kefka doesn't put up much of a fight. He simply retreats from each combat after taking a single hit before commanding a group of Imperial soldiers to deal with the two would-be heroes. This is an interesting narrative device, as all too often a JRPG would simply build a villain throughout the course of the game, with the only battle encounter happening at the very end. Here, we get a quick battle that is practically over before it even begins. It makes the player wonder whether Kefka is even the major antagonist of the game, or if it might be Emperor Gestal, or maybe even someone else altogether who hasn't yet been revealed. So Kefka's quick escape allows him to poison the water supply of Doma's castle, which begins to kill off the inhabitants in short order. Cyan gets to witness his king die right in front of him before he rushes to his living quarters, only to watch his wife and son take their last breaths in his arms. So with all the citizens of Doma dead and dying, Cyan does what any exemplar of chivalry or Bushido would do: seek to honor and avenge the death of his people by vanquishing his enemies in combat. He does so by rushing headlong into the nearby Imperial camp, where Sabin and Shadow offer to lend a hand. Realizing that the three of them are in over their heads and vastly outnumbered, the three escape to the nearby Phantom Forest. When they finally work their way out of the forest, they stumble upon a train that they believe to be part of an old abandoned Doman railway. It's only after they board the train and it suddenly departs that they realize they have boarded the Phantom Train, an ethereal machine that shepherds recently departed souls to the afterlife. Not wanting to make this one-way trip just yet, the three are understandably desperate to disembark and hastily fight their way through some close encounters with ghosts and specters before reaching the train's front engine compartment, only to enter into combat with the train itself in order to stop it. And while this combat encounter can be frustratingly difficult due to bad RNG, it's also home to one of the most famous memes in gaming history, as Sabin can use a blitz attack to suplex the train like a professional wrestler. If you haven't seen it before, well, now you have. So the train makes a stop at another secluded station, and the three get a momentary respite from the excitement before the relief is shattered when Cyan has to watch his wife and son board the train on their way to the afterlife. Now Cyan, who has literally just lost his home, his family, and his kingdom, pledges his life to fighting the Empire and allies himself with the returners. Now Shadow, having experienced his fair share of excitement, departs the group while Sabin and Cyan continue onwards to Narsha. To get there, they must cross the Serpent Trench, for which they need an underwater breathing device which a feral boy living in the wild named Gao helps them secure. Gao is a comic relief character above all else. His backstory has some depth, but it's not investigated until much later in the game. For now, he's a formidable battle companion, having survived his entire life in the wild fighting monsters. The three have a relatively uneventful jaunt to the town of Nikke, where they hop a ship bound for Narsha. With all three groups gathered and united, it's worth pointing out how refreshing it is that a town like Narsha would play such a pivotal location where so many stories and characters intersect and converge. Usually a small little sleepy mountainside town in a JRPG would just be set dressing in a grand sweeping narrative, and yet in Final Fantasy VI, it is a central location through which so many plot threads are woven. And the tapestry that these plot threads weave is about as intricate as it gets. Narsha's town elder is hesitant about taking sides between the Empire and the Returners, and he has every right to be considering that a dozen of his town guard were annihilated in the opening scene of the game. He would understandably want to spare his remaining citizens a similar fate. Banon implores the Elder to see the bigger picture about how Imperial control of the Esper located in Narsha could easily give the Empire unlimited power in global domination. Sabin, Cyan, and Gao arrive with information on the fate of Doma, which only makes the Elder even more hesitant, since Doma is an example of what the Empire does to anyone who sides with the Returners. It's only when Locke arrives with insider knowledge of the Empire's plot to invade Narsha that the Elder's perspective begins to shift. But perhaps the more interesting philosophical quandary lies between Cyan and Celes. As Cyan is still overcoming the grief of losing his entire family and kingdom, he is zealously opposed to anything and anyone associated with the Empire. Cyan's turmoil is an internal one, almost a spiritual one, as he has to overcome his emotional outrage and not be ruled by it. He must, as is the code of chivalry and bushido that he embodies, be master of his emotions first and foremost. Terra's admission to once serving the Empire, albeit against her will, shows the desire and potential for Imperial agents to cast off the yoke of imperialism in a quest for redemption. And perhaps, due to his failure to protect his people, Edgar's singular line in this conversation perfectly encapsulates the most sensible perspective on the issue when he says, "The Empire is evil, but not all of its citizens are." This is sound advice, even in our world whenever wars break out between nation-states. As Kefka marches towards Narsha with an entire platoon of Imperial soldiers and all the characters assembled to defend the Empire, Cyan, still wary and unsettled, tells Celes he doesn't quite trust her yet. Her response is about as poignant as it gets when she tells him, "Fine, use your own eyes, then decide." So the combined efforts of our cast of characters manages to repel the invading Imperial force, upon which a magical reaction occurs once again when Terra gets too close to the Esper. Only this time, the reaction is far more severe and leads to one of the most ear-splitting and bone-chilling screams in gaming history as Terra morphs into an alien-looking creature and flies off uncontrollably. This ends the first act of Final Fantasy VI as the focus of the game now turns to a race to find Terra and investigating the secret of the Espers, with our cast of characters and the Empire on opposing sides of this wild goose chase. And what an opening act it is! We have all the pieces in place for an epic story, and anyone who plays through the entire game will find a lot to like about the narrative. Again, Final Fantasy VI is one of the best examples in gaming history of a game that says a lot with very few words. And best of all, it's not too difficult to experience this masterpiece for yourself if you're so inclined. Since its initial release on the Super Nintendo, it has been ported to the Game Boy Advance, the PlayStation 1, and the more recent SNES Classic mini console. A mobile version was created for iOS and Android devices and later ported to Steam on the PC. And finally, the Pixel Remaster version was released on PC and announced for PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. But I'm curious, if you've never played Final Fantasy VI before, does this opening act do anything to convince you to give it a shot? And if you did play this game, how does it stack up in terms of nostalgia? I'd love to hear your thoughts on the game in the comments below. If you'd like to see me do more critical story analysis, please consider liking this video and subscribing to my channel. It'll encourage me to keep creating content. Thank you for sticking around and allowing me to share my thoughts on one of the most well-written game stories of all time.